So sometimes like you really need to throw or just put aside what you did and just think differently about the problem, because technology enables you to do so many things that you couldn't do it before. And if you have this legacy that kind of like drags you back, I would say just reimagine and rethink about what can be done with training, learning and development, because it can just be tenfold better. So it's worth the investment.
Welcome back to the Human ROI Podcast. I'm your host, Elissa Mahendra. I created this space around a simple but often overlooked idea. People aren't separate from ROI in organizations. They're how ROI is created. I've spent more than 20 years in talent, leadership, and organizational transformation, and I'll tell you, I've seen what happens when companies invest in their people the right way and what it costs them when they don't. So on this podcast, we explore leadership, culture, and talent systems and how they either compound your value or erode it over time. You'll hear conversations with leaders, builders, thinkers, and change makers who are shaping the future of work. And we'll share some practical insights that you can apply right away. Because whether you're leading a company or you're building your own career, understanding human ROI is everything. And when you invest wisely, it pays dividends. I am so pleased to welcome today's guest on the Human ROI, Omer Glass, who is co-founder and CEO at GrowthSpace. Welcome, Omer.
Thank you, Elissa.
I just have to spend a moment to really, and I'll use your language, to introduce GrowthSpace, because I've been in contact with you and learned about GrowthSpace in the last year, and I've been so impressed as someone who grew up in learning and development and talent management. And so I'm going to read a little bit about what GrowthSpace is, because I think words matter, and I really want to give the context as the backdrop to our conversation. So you call GrowthSpace the world's first precision skill development platform, and you're using AI to match individuals to cohorts with domain expertise for development sprints. And the individuals can assess their skill gaps and seamlessly automate program execution and measurement so you can leverage it at scale in your organization. And currently, Space leverages a network of over 2,800 global experts in 65 countries across 80 plus skill sets. So I just had to mention those numbers because while I know it's impressive, I think that's really helpful to get a backdrop about GrowthSpace and the organization.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think what we try to do with this concept of basically matching people with experts, what we do is matching with people with experts who specialize in a skill and share their background, right? And we try to imagine the best way you can develop someone. Take someone from A to B, and we always realize that, let's say you have a CEO who needs something, you will usually not send him to your content library, but you will find someone who's really, really good in this challenge and just match them. And yeah, magic will happen. So this is kind of like the idea behind GrowthSpace.
But I love that. And this isn't your kind of first rodeo into career development. And I always like to start with the origin story. So a moment that shaped how people decided to follow their passion, how GrowthSpace was born, where, it's often driven from a passion and or you're seeing a need in the market, not necessarily thinking about, oh, there's a market opportunity on a spreadsheet. It came from real experience with real people. So can you take us back to the moment where you talked to your co-founder and said, this is the thing we need to build?
Sure. So I think, first of all, I was always a geek of personal development, skill development. So I started another startup of like career development in around 2010. I worked in a management consulting company, and kind of like as a hobby, I was in charge of the learning and development because it was really interesting for me. Like, how can you become better? And so GrowthSpace started, my co-founder, Dan, actually, he was a COO of a fast growing startup, and they had a very high churn. So they try to understand why. And so we did some exit interviews, surveys, and he understood that people are leaving because the company is not investing enough in their development. Many solutions. So we brought some e-learning workshops, we brought coaching and stuff like that. And what he figured out is basically nothing ticked the mark, right? And then he gives me a call. It was 2018. Omer, he told me the story. This is what happened. How do you create effective employee development? And then I said, you know what? I don't think anyone knows. So we understood there is basically kind of like a gap in the market. And when we did the research, we found that there were a lot of basically coaching. There's a lot of coaching in the world, a lot of coaching platforms doing great stuff. But when you try to leverage them for skill development, it doesn't work, basically. Because the coaches are not specialists in skill development and usually they do not share the participants' background. So we understood, okay, coaching is great, but minus the ICF and plus the skill development piece, like the skill expertise, kind of like medicine, and plus the background. And basically that's how we started GrowthSpace.
Yeah, I love that because growing up through learning and development and talent management, I've been responsible for creating those strategies internally and realizing that certain interventions or solutions or engagements yield a higher ROI than others. And organizations are spending billions of dollars on learning and development, but the investment is falling short to your co-founder's experience. And so as you've invested in GrowthSpace over the last several years, what have you noticed that is fundamentally broken in organizations of how they have been approaching skill development and how GrowthSpace helps to fix it?
So I think you start with the learner, right? And kind of like a product builds a product for their customers, not for me. So as a learning and development professional, you need to build products for your learners. And there is like some colleague of mine told me like the phrase respect the learner, right? Which is everyone thinks they're doing it, but not actually doing it.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you just give everyone kind of like, yeah, I want to give everyone something, so I'm buying this e-learning platform, and then you don't see they're utilizing it. So I would say stop basically and do the opposite. Basically try to understand what they're struggling with and give them the right solution instead of trying to kind of like give programs for everyone because just this is what we do. So I think the best companies who execute a really, really good learning and development initiatives would be initiatives that started from basically the ground up, bottom up, and not top down. So you really need to understand pains and how do I solve for these pains with learning and development and not vice versa. And I think the second piece is just the measurement piece is the more focused you are about the outcome that you want to get. And the outcome is never participation. It's never utilization. It's never how many people logged in. It's the actual numbers, the actual business impact that the management, the board cares about. I think if you basically do these two components, so you understand the needs from your customers, you understand what you're trying to solve from the customers, and then you create things. Your lens is basically these two things. You will do great things regardless of like who's your vendors, who's the facilitator. These things are secondary to basically how you start.
Yeah. And I think that's why I was so impressed with GrowthSpace because again, growing up in the L&D space, there was a joke we used to say, like, we're not in the business of sheep dip, where you're just going to put people through a training program and all of a sudden they're better at something. It's in the practice and it's the application of what they're learning. And then being able to say, how are we measuring this? And, you and I could geek out on Kirkpatrick's levels of evaluation, but really it's the ROI. It's what is the return on investment? Because you're not only paying the vendor, you're not only designing the program, you're creating the investment in your people and taking them away from their day-to-day roles. But how are you really measuring the ROI and skill development? And what I love about what you're talking about with GrowthSpace is precision skill development. So you were very intentional with the language, but I want to talk about why precision in this context and how that changes the return on investment that people get because it's precise.
So think about, you always have a challenge, right? And it's always 80-20. The Pareto always works. So usually with most employees, if you will focus on 20% of the challenges, you will get 80% of the benefit. So you need to pinpoint really what matters. What is the specific problem for this specific employee in their specific role? So it can be a salesperson who is very good in managing a process, but they're not so exciting in the beginning. Right? It gets very granular about the skills. Or the same salesperson or another salesperson from their team that is not so organized. So they're very exciting and then so on and so forth. They're not so organized. Others do not know how to negotiate, for example, right? It's always about a very specific skill in every role. If you understand exactly what skill you need to focus on, and then you're matched with someone who knows basically this is all they do. Kind of like in medicine, you have a skin problem, you're not going to your GP.
Sure.
You're going to the dermatologist, right? So the same concept. If you can basically meet someone who specializes on your specific skill, guiding the customers, being organized in the sales process or negotiation, it is examples, and they will work for you in a very surgical way on this skill. For like our basic model is basically 5 1 hour sessions because we believe that if it takes more than that, we failed, basically. So at least if we fail fast and do not fail after 6 9 months, 1 year. And on top of that, let's say the expert also understands your background. They worked in sales in my example, and they worked in pharma, which is what you're selling, right? They will understand basically where you're coming from, so it will be very, very efficient. So I think that's kind of like how we think about it, like solving a problem. That's precision, working on the right skill that matters the most by someone who really can help you with that and do it in a very fast way. So, you know what, if I failed, at least I fail after 5 sessions, not after a year, because then I can course correct. So kind of like product thinking.
Yeah, and it is that product thinking. It's the iterative approach. It's doing it quickly. The pace and complexity of business today, especially with AI accelerating things, is so important. And I want to draw attention to something else you're building because I think precision skill development is one thing. The other thing that I was really impressed with, and I was thinking back to my experience of being with large multinational organizations who had a lot of institutional knowledge that was leaking because their top seller left or their top engineer got recruited away or the best performers were retiring and they were holding it all in their head. And the knowledge transfer wasn't effective because they weren't writing SOPs and things like that. But how are you really extracting that institutional knowledge? And I love what you're doing. So could you share a little bit about that use case?
Of course. 2.5 years ago when LLM started, so we have this great business growing fast, a lot of Fortune 500 customers, everything is working great, but then LLM start, and you think, what am I doing with it? Or basically, how do I do what I do better with it? We think human to human is super important. People really want to meet with experts, really understand. Like the human component is important. But then when LLM came, we thought, okay, let's say you're an expert in GrowthSpace. So I'm meeting you, but your time is limited. So how can I benefit from your knowledge outside of the real sessions where I meet you, right, in a sprint? So we basically built a technology that creates agents that are modeled after real experts for two purposes. As you mentioned, knowledge transfer. So I can ask you a question and your agent can give me an answer. So instead of coming to you, I can go basically to your agent. And the second piece is basically training delivery. So you can role play with the agent can deliver a presentation, and the agent can just talk to you and kind of like, but it's a structured, skill focused sessions. Basically, it's like that's how we started. Technology that builds agents after people. What we found with our customers is not only they're interested in working with our experts after the sessions, but they started basically asking us to build agents after their subject matter experts, their CEOs, their founders, their trainers. And suddenly, because you have a limited expertise in a company, I think that like as you mentioned, Have a few people who are experts and not everyone have access to. And your knowledge data is not so organized. It's usually in people's heads, right? Like 90% of it. So what if now you can build agents after these experts so everyone can get access? So it's kind of like the other side of the picture. If GrowthSpace was started as an external expert who can help your people to be better, most of the help will come internally, not externally. So with ExpertX, you can basically build agents after your, again, trainers, SMEs, and so on and so forth. So it creates a much more efficient organization as a whole.
Yeah, the combination of the two is why I was so impressed with GrowthSpace. And I said, we have to get this conversation on the books because I think so many leaders, certainly in my network being HR leaders, need to hear this because this is different than anything I've seen on the market. I've gone to large organizational conferences, industry conferences, and I don't see anything like this. I think I see people talking about career development and talking about scaling, but scale is so important in organizations today. We're doing more with less, we're implementing AI. How can it help us? But for leaders in organizations who are thinking about the importance of investing and developing and retaining their talent, but doing so at scale. Can you talk about the ROI that you've seen some of your clients have with these tools?
A very big use case and a big problem of almost every company is succession. So how do you prepare people for succession? Succession readiness, usually you measure ready now, like if you're basically the people who are up for succession are ready, right, or not. Usually organizations will see that 50% of the roles do not have a ready now successor. So there, what we do usually is, again, match them with the expert. We'll just focus on what's missing, right? To make them ready now. And typically we would see a 20 to 30% increase. So if you were at 40, which is very typical for a lot of Fortune 500, we will see you go basically up to 60 with that. So a really significant change, so around 30%. Number two, manager effectiveness. Manager effectiveness, usually we measure it with internal manager effectiveness scores. Every company has this metric. Or a lot of times they're looking at retention of the people who report to these managers. Because if you have better managers, less people leave. That's kind of like the number one factor that makes people leave the organization. So again, we do this intervention. And usually in order to prove it, we start with kind of like a test group, a control group to isolate confounding variables. But we typically will see 10% increase in manager effectiveness and also retention. Two more interesting use cases are in sales and in service. So usually you're looking at like sales metrics, like sales performance, or more specific ones like top of funnel conversion, for example. Very easy to measure because it's very data driven. And with service, the similar thing for kind of like customer retention, net promoter score, and so on and so forth. And the nice thing in every use case, you basically work with different set of experts and tools also. So in sales, you will work with people with sales background, in service background, in succession, people who understand successions. Can basically, it's kind of like segmentations of our pool that are dedicated to different use cases.
All right, let's take a quick pause here. Because if you're listening to this and thinking, I'm dealing with something just like this, you're probably not alone. Behind the scenes, I'm having tons of conversations with leaders navigating this right now. So I'd love to connect on LinkedIn. Tell me what resonated. Tell me what challenged you. Tell us what you want us to dig into next. I'm always open to conversation. All right, let's get back to it. Yeah, again, I really wanted to get that out in the world so our listeners could hear it because it's not butts and seats. It's not they completed the course. They're actually moving the needle on real business outcomes. And it was interesting because, again, growing up through learning and development and talent management, I would also always challenge our vendors and solution providers around ROI. And all they could tell me was percentage of usage of the learning management system, for example, which, by the way, was pretty terrible. So we're investing in this thing that maybe 20 to 30% of our employees were taking advantage of. And that was only a consumption metric. So again, a really standout solution and really helping to address some of the pain that organizations are experiencing right now. So if there's a business leader who's listening to this and they're thinking about, I'm spending money on learning and development, but I can't tell my board what the return is. How would you coach them around turning skill development from a cost center into a value driver? And some of it may be the ROI that you just mentioned, but how would you coach them to share that with their board or their executive team on the ROI as a value driver?
So we start saying that it is ideal to do this test group, control group concept, kind of like, every academic experiment. It can really help if you can demonstrate your value on real business metrics, right? That's the best thing. But not always you can do that, right? Because sometimes there are, again, a lot of confounding variables. Go prove that this is the only thing that was like different between two groups. Few organizations will do these experiments. I think it's very important when you do something, at least approve it and then look for the metrics that the board or the CEO cares about. That's the easy piece. The hardest piece is if you cannot do it, what do you do, right? So I think if you need to think about enablement in the flow of work always. Like, how do I help people just with their daily problems? The questions that they're getting that are not being asked. Like, we work, for example, in a great use case of ExpertX with agricultural company, works with channel partners. And so there are a lot of people like from partners who are selling your product. They don't really know your product. And then they're meeting farmers and they need to like recommend a specific solution. No chance in the world they will know that. So suddenly we built ExpertX after their like someone from the company, subject matter expert who can basically provide recommendation. And then suddenly the channel partners, and actually not all the channel partners, also the salespeople can use it in order to basically have a much more educated sales calls. So can I attribute their success only to that? You know what? Maybe I can do it also before and after, but even if I do not, if I do not do a test, I think still just getting the feedback from the people, hey, this thing really helped me, coming back to the user is really meaningful.
I think what's unique maybe about your solution set, both the Expert X and the precision skill development, is that it does apply to so many use cases. It does apply to so many audiences. So I think about most L&D leaders, most HR teams are focused on investing in their full-time employees and or just their manager population. But I know through our conversations that you have some really unique use cases. So again, without giving too much away, you're working with a number of top Fortune companies. You're working in really interesting ways of different employee profiles. Can you share a little bit more about how people should expand their thinking beyond FTE? Full-time employees
Yeah.
for those listening?
Yeah, of course. So I think AI, the problem usually with learning and development, with training is cost, right? If you could, you would fly everyone in and give them the best expert in the world and so on and so forth. And also for us, like the expert-led skill development, the personal skill development we talked about, we created a very economical model, but it's not cheap and companies will not give it usually to temporary employees. As you said, it will give it to critical roles, to top talents, to high potentials, and so on and so forth, right? Salespeople a lot of times. But what do you do about everyone? Again, FTs and non-FTs, like you mentioned. So I think their AI can really change your game completely because again, you can do the same things with the ability, talking about what we do, to build agents after the real people who are training it. For example, working with a company that what they're doing is just providing presentation coaching. They have a presentation coach internally, and they want to just give everyone who is customer facing this presentation coach so they could practice before every call. You couldn't do that. You have just one person on thousands of people, and suddenly you just build an agent after this presentation coach works internally. And suddenly every employee has a tool and it's significantly cheaper because it's AI based. So you can completely reimagine everything and make it much more personalized, but more important, much more relevant because it is modeled after your subject matter experts, your trainers, your methodologies. So it's very tailored basically to you. It's not off the shelf like role playing solution.
Yeah, and when you were talking about that, I was thinking, wow, I grew up in financial services, over a decade in private equity, and I thought, multiple uninvested capital just went up quite a bit in that scenario because you're scaling the output. You're scaling this ability to reach more people in a way that meets them in the flow of work and is really just very interesting to me. So I want to address again the leaders who are listening, where their current learning and development solution, their current mentoring program, it's not delivering the return it should. What's one thing that a leader would be able to do in the next 30 days to change that?
First of all, I would focus on less. If you're not happy with what's happening, just sometimes do less will give more. Do less, but the right things, and do like a lot of things that do not work, right? And start with a few. Start with one thing that works. So I think that's the first thing. Just I'm not saying throw everything, but just start maybe one thing that works, and then like gradually you will replace everything. It really helps when you just need to solve one problem and not all the problems. And again, focus on what matters the most. Again, to the management, to the CEO, to the board. I think the second thing is just a lot of times the AI is kind of like a before and after, right? And if you have a lot of things that you started before, I would say 2024 programs that you started before 2024, they're not AI native. So sometimes, like, you really need to throw or just put aside what you did and just think differently about the problem, because technology enables you to do so many things that you couldn't do it before. And if you have this legacy that kind of like drags you back, I would say just reimagine and rethink about what can be done with training, learning, and development, because it can just be tenfold better. So it's worth the investment.
Yeah, I'm thinking of too many questions for you, so I have to land on one at a time because I'm just so fascinated with this. With AI and scaling the solutions, what have you seen? Because I know that you're sitting on panels with some of the biggest tech firms in many industries, and they're not surprisingly as far along on the frontier of AI enablement as the market would have us believe, with all of the articles around AI is taking people's jobs and AI is accelerating things. And so as you think about what GrowthSpace has to offer and being an AI native solution with Expert X, how can people think about that differently?
So I think, first of all, I saw two things, or two, I would say, trends with the Fortune 10 companies. So one is we're so big, so everything takes too much time. So you see companies with no agents, for example, right? Like there was a question to someone in a panel from the Fortune 10, hey, what agents are you building? And they're still like, we're working on it. So sometimes kind of like just thinking everything through is your enemy, and you have to pilot, you have to test, you have to think more like a start. So I think that's the first thing or recommendation I would give. The second base is we're seeing also a Fortune 10 company who's building everything internal, which is also great. Like if you have the privilege, they have like 150 engineers focused on basically building something very similar to what we're building with ExpertX, right? If you have the privilege, do it. It will be amazing. It will be yours, right? But I think if you don't have the luxury of now hiring 150 engineers to build you kind of like agents modeled after your subject matter experts, I would say just better to look for external solutions. Like WorldSpace can be one of them, but not necessarily. It doesn't really matter. Something that fits your specific needs. So you need to move fast. You need to experiment fast. And again, ask your networks like what's working for them, because usually you will get the best things.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were saying that, I was thinking about, I wonder if they've done the cost benefit analysis here about building internally versus leveraging someone who's kind of tested it and figured it out already. And GrowthSpace may be part of that equation. As we're exploring the frontier of AI, there was a statistic that I read recently that 78% of organizations are being asked to implement AI, but 80% of those organizations have not seen a return to their bottom line or to their revenue. So this is an opportunity to be on the frontier of this movement. What would you say to those leaders as they're thinking about, I have a mandate from my board or my executive team to implement AI in the flow of work and keep humans in the loop? I really do believe in it. How do they get started if they're being mandated but don't know where to start?
So first of all, if you do not understand, do not start. That could be your worst. Basically, I had a one-on-one with my VP R&D, and this weekend he told me that he met some VP R&D of other startups colleagues who just like their CEO told them to use a lot of tokens, and that's the easiest thing to do because you're just like it's very easy to burn tokens, right? The easiest thing. We'll burn tokens, as you said. Like, what's the impact on the bottom line? If you're using tokens and as an engineer, but you cannot prove that now you're writing 10x code, so you're 10x basically more efficient or less errors or whatever, like start with the business metric always, right? So if you're looking at, I don't know, learning and development related topics like we mentioned, so yeah, look at actual impact on people's bottom line, but do not do things just for the sake of using AI without really understanding. So you start with the outcome, you start with your target audience, and then you just deploy AI and not just deploy AI for the sake of deploying AI.
That's so well said. And again, what I've been in lots of conversations around, AI and particularly AI for HR people, because HR is now, as we're seeing, there are whole departments being reorganized around HR being the owner of AI in terms of how it's being enabled into the talent in the workforce, whereas the chief technology officer certainly owns the technology, but HR owns the people side of the equation. And so, can you share a little bit about the conversations you're having with heads of HR and where their head is as it relates to investing in AI meaningfully around enablement, not just as a tool?
Sure. So first of all, I think HR has basically a huge role in this thing because the whole AI revolution is dependent on people and people are under HR, right? So you see a lot of companies, right? The biggest companies in the world, like you just find chief HR and AI officer, for example, right? So you have a big role because also it's important to say it's scary. A lot of people has resistance and what about will he take my job and so on and so forth. So a lot of basically ethical elements. But coming back to your question, just about again how you start with the end. You start with what you're trying to achieve. I'm trying to write code more efficiently, right? I'm trying to be more productive with my engineering, or I'm trying to enable salespeople to do their work more effectively, to spend less time creating collateral, to spend less time reaching out, like getting information, right? According to HBR, 20% of the people spend 20% of their time searching for knowledge and 14% of their time recreating it. So a third of your time is spent on knowledge, right? If I can prove that with expert X, for the sake of an example, you can reduce that in half, you just saved a lot of hours for money. So just start with what you're trying to solve for, define your project, find the right solution. But do it fast. That's the important thing. Just do it fast, pilot it fast, get value fast, because if not, you can find yourself in 2 years still figuring out the right solution.
Like some of the Fortune 10 that you've been talking about, because you're building something that has to scale. So it's preventing you from getting started, which I think sometimes is a trap. So if I can wrap this, and we could spend all day talking about this, what I heard from you is, in order to scale the impact, start small. Start with one use case. I also heard you share, think like a startup, fail fast, and pick one thing and be willing to test different variables. And then you'll know what works for you. So I just appreciate that perspective, because I think so many HR leaders in my network are grappling with this right now, which is, how do I do it meaningfully? So not just do an AI implementation for AI implementation's sake, but really tie it back to, how are we going to measure this in our business context? So I really appreciate the conversation. I look forward to continuing to watch your journey at GrowthSpace as you continue to build and scale and make real impact and real human ROI inside organizations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for investing your time with us here on the Human ROI Podcast. If this episode gave you a new perspective, something to take back into your work, I'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, or share it with someone in your network. Because this show doesn't grow by the algorithm. It grows through real dialogue. And if you want to keep the conversation going, I'd love to. You can find me on LinkedIn or follow along on my newsletter, The Human ROI. So until next time, remember, your people are not a cost center. They are your greatest source for value creation.